The Georgia sun beat down mercilessly as recruits filed into Fort Benning's training yard, their boots crunching against the gravel in synchronized rhythm. Lieutenant Colonel Bradford stood on the observation deck, his weathered face shielded by dark sunglasses, scanning the sea of fresh faces with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen thousands of soldiers pass through these gates over the past 23 years. His gaze methodically swept across rows of nervous recruits, some standing tall with confidence, others visibly trembling with the weight of the moment they'd been anticipating for months. His attention suddenly focused on one particular soldier, Private First Class Sarah. She was unmistakably small-framed, standing barely 5'4" among a sea of taller recruits. Her uniform, despite being freshly issued, seemed almost too large for her lean body. Her dark eyes were fixed straight ahead, betraying no emotion, no fear, no excitement, just absolute neutrality. Bradford's lips curled into something approaching a smirk as he continued his assessment. Everything about her screamed inadequacy for the rigorous demands ahead. "That one won't last," Bradford muttered to Sergeant Hayes, who stood rigidly beside him, also monitoring the recruits below. His tone carried the certainty of absolute conviction, the confidence of a man who'd never been wrong about these assessments. "Too fragile. Look at her, she's practically skeletal. She'll wash out by week 2, guaranteed. Mark my words. Probably can't even carry her own weapon properly." Sergeant Hayes, a grizzled veteran with 30 years of service and a face like weathered leather, glanced at Sarah briefly. He didn't comment, having learned long ago that Bradford's judgments were rarely questioned. Hayes had seen plenty of unexpected soldiers succeed, but he kept that observation to himself. Officers like Bradford had their reputations to protect, and challenging them served no one. Sarah heard every word. Despite standing 50 yards away, something about her acute awareness caught the careless comment, whether through intuition or simply because she'd learned to listen carefully to every sound around her. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, barely noticeable unless someone was watching closely. But she didn't break stride. She didn't look up. She didn't give any visible reaction. Instead, she simply continued forward with the same measured pace, her eyes remaining locked forward as if nothing had registered at all. The other recruits around her exchanged knowing glances. The hierarchy was already forming, invisible but palpable. Sarah had just been marked. She was the weak link, the one who wouldn't make it, the obstacle that would be eliminated in the natural selection process of military training. Some recruits looked at her with pity, others with something closer to relief, grateful they weren't the obvious target for skepticism. That evening, as darkness fell over the barracks and most of her bunkmates drifted into exhausted sleep, Sarah stared at the ceiling above her bunk, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. Her bunkmate, Private, snored softly from the mattress below, having crashed the moment his head hit the pillow. But sleep eluded Sarah completely. Her mind replayed the officer's words over and over, each repetition hardening her resolve. She thought of her small Montana, population 2,847, where everyone knew everyone else's business. She thought of her father, a mechanic who'd never understood why his daughter wanted to join the military instead of pursuing a normal career. She thought of her high school guidance counselor, who'd suggested that perhaps Sarah should consider nursing instead, as it was more suitable for girls like her. She thought of every person who'd told her, with varying degrees of gentleness or bluntness, that the army was no place for girls like her. Small girls, quiet girls, girls without obvious physical advantages. This moment, standing in this barracks, having heard an officer dismiss her before she'd even had the chance to prove herself, was exactly why she'd enlisted. This was her opportunity. This was her stage. This was where she would prove them all wrong, not through words or promises, but through undeniable action and measurable results. The ceiling fan above her rotated slowly, creaking with each revolution. Sarah focused on the sound, using it as an anchor for her racing thoughts. She made herself a silent promise in that moment, a vow that Lieutenant Colonel Bradford would know her name by the end of this training, not because she'd complained or made excuses, not because she'd drawn attention to herself, but because she would outwork, outthink, and outperform every single person in this program, regardless of what they thought about her small frame or quiet demeanor. Sleep finally came near midnight, but it was restless and filled with dreams of running, of pushing, of proving. When dawn broke, Sarah was already awake, lying in the darkness, waiting for the morning bell that would signal the first full day of her transformation. Week 3 arrived with the kind of brutal, unforgiving intensity that separated the mentally prepared from the completely unprepared. The training escalated exponentially each day, as if the instructors had collectively decided that Week 2 had been too lenient, too accommodating. Sarah threw herself into every challenge with a ferocity that surprised even herself. The classroom portions came easily: map reading, weapons maintenance, tactical theory, military history, survival protocols. Her analytical mind absorbed information like a sponge, cross-referencing details, committing everything to permanent memory. She earned perfect scores on every written examination, often the first to finish and the last to leave, double-checking her work while others turned in hastily completed papers. But the physical demands were an entirely different beast, one that didn't care about intelligence or determination or quiet resolve. They were merciless, indifferent, crushing. Sarah ran with the unit every dawn, her smaller frame requiring exponentially more effort to cover the same distance as her taller, longer-legged counterparts. What took a 6-foot-tall recruit 4 strides took her 5 or 6. While others' legs churned with mechanical efficiency, hers worked overtime, burning calories and energy at a rate that seemed unsustainable. Her lungs adapted faster than her muscles. Her cardiovascular system responded beautifully to the conditioning. But her legs screamed in constant protest. Blisters formed on the heels of her feet during the first week of intensive running. She treated them that evening, tape and antibiotic ointment becoming her nightly ritual. By the end of week 1, those blisters had burst and reformed into calluses. By the end of week 2, the calluses had developed their own calluses. Her feet became something almost inhuman, hardened leather barely recognizable as human skin. She'd examine them each night with detached curiosity, as if they belonged to someone else entirely. Sergeant, the harshest of all the training staff, seemed to take personal satisfaction in pushing Sarah beyond everyone else. He had the eyes of a man who'd seen too much combat, experienced too much loss, and believed that suffering was the only true teacher. His approach to Sarah felt almost personal, as if her small frame and quiet demeanor had offended him on a fundamental level. He assigned her extra duties constantly: additional weapon maintenance after everyone else had finished, extra guard duties during night shifts, supplementary conditioning sessions that pushed her to the absolute edge of collapse. "If you're going to be out here," would growl, his voice like gravel in a tin can, "you're going to earn your place, and right now you haven't earned anything." Sarah never complained. She never asked for mercy or relief. She simply completed every task, no matter how unreasonable, and reported back for more. There was something in its relentless pushing that aligned perfectly with her own internal drive. While other recruits resented his harshness, Sarah saw it as an opportunity. If she could survive's worst, she could survive anything. Then came the morning that changed everything. A grueling 10-mile run in full combat gear, 70 pounds of equipment strapped to exhausted bodies, conducted under the unrelenting Georgia heat. Sarah had been fine for the first 7 miles. Her breathing was controlled, her pace steady, her mental focus sharp. But somewhere around mile 8 something shifted. The world began to shift and blur around the edges of her vision. Her foot felt strange, not just tired but fundamentally wrong. Sharp pain shot through her left ankle with each stride, a stabbing sensation that radiated up her calf and into her shin. She pushed through. That was the rule: you never stopped. You never showed weakness. You pushed through until you couldn't anymore, and then you pushed through a little more. By mile 9, her vision was swimming. Sweat poured down her face in quantities that seemed impossible. Her body was screaming at her to stop, to sit down, to give up. She finished the run in the middle of the pack, respectable but not impressive. She'd somehow managed to hide the complete internal collapse happening within her body. That night found her in the bathroom, collapsed on the cold tile floor, delirious with severe dehydration. Her skin was burning hot despite the chill coursing through her body. She was shaking uncontrollably, her teeth chattering so hard she thought they might crack. Immediately called for medical assistance. The medic's diagnosis was delivered with professional gravity, severe dehydration and a stress fracture forming in her left foot. Rest required, 6 to 8 weeks minimum, restricted duty, recycled to the next training cohort. Medical discharge papers were already being prepared. Bradford's earlier prediction seemed not just possible but inevitable. The officer had been right. She wouldn't last, not like this. Medical discharge papers sat on Sarah's bed in the hospital ward, crisp white forms with official seals and signature lines waiting to be filled. She stared at them for nearly an hour, her mind cycling through a spectrum of emotions: despair, anger, resignation, and finally, a cold, burning determination that crystallized into absolute certainty. The papers represented the end of a dream that had only just begun. They represented validation of every doubt anyone had ever expressed about her capabilities. They represented failure. She ripped them to shreds. The medic on duty heard the violent tearing sound and rushed over, expecting a medical emergency. Instead, he found Sarah sitting calmly among scattered paper fragments, her expression serene despite the chaos around her. "Private, those are official documents. You can't just—" "I'm not leaving," Sarah interrupted, her voice steady and measured despite the intensity in her eyes. "Not like this. Not as a failure. The fracture will heal. My body is stronger than you think. I'll sign whatever liability waiver you need. I'll take full responsibility, but I'm not going home with a medical discharge. I'm finishing this training." The medic, accustomed to soldiers accepting their circumstances with resignation, was momentarily taken aback. "Private, the stress fracture in your foot could become a permanent injury if you don't rest properly. 6 to 8 weeks minimum. That's not negotiable from a medical standpoint." "1 week," Sarah said flatly. "Clear me in 1 week. I'll do everything you tell me to do. Physical therapy twice a day if necessary. Complete rest otherwise. But in 1 week I'm returning to my unit." Arguments erupted in the medical tent over the following hours. The base physician was called in. The training command was consulted. Military regulations regarding injury recovery were cited repeatedly. Sarah remained unmoved, her resolve seemingly carved from stone. There was something in her demeanor, not anger, not desperation, but absolute conviction, that suggested she would not accept any outcome except the one she'd decided upon. Something in her determination, perhaps a recognition of the kind of will that rarely manifests in human beings, convinced the medical staff. After 7 agonizing days of intensive physical therapy and strict rest, she was cleared to return to her unit. The physician made her sign additional waivers accepting full liability for any complications. Sarah signed without hesitation. Her return to the unit was not triumphant. It was grinding, painful, and marked by visible struggle. She limped noticeably during formation, favoring her right leg while the left foot sent sharp reminders with each step. The other recruits noticed immediately. Some looked sympathetic. Others, particularly those who'd been competing with her for rankings, looked satisfied. She was finally damaged goods. Sargent seemed to find new satisfaction in her compromised state, increasing her duties even further, as if testing whether she'd finally break. Extra weapon maintenance, additional guard duties, supplementary conditioning sessions that pushed the boundaries of what a partially injured soldier should endure. It would have been reasonable for her to complain, to ask for modified duty to protect her healing foot. Sarah did none of those things. Instead, something fundamental shifted in her approach. She began waking at 4 a.m. before dawn, before anyone else stirred in the barracks. She'd limp to the half-mile perimeter running track and begin running, slow at first, the pain almost unbearable with each impact. But she ran. Mile after mile, lap after lap, she ran through the pain, understanding that avoidance wouldn't solve anything. She ran until the sharp stabbing pain began transforming into a duller ache. She ran until her body stopped protesting quite so violently. She ran because she understood something crucial that separated soldiers from civilians. Sometimes the only way through is directly forward. By the end of week 6, the limp had disappeared almost completely. The stress fracture had healed stronger than before, reinforced through careful but consistent stress. The pain was gone, but more importantly, infinitely more importantly, something invisible had crystallized within her. Sarah had discovered a resource more powerful than any physical attribute, more valuable than any genetic advantage: absolute, unbreakable will. She began studying the top performers obsessively, how they breathed during long runs, how they paced themselves, understanding that victory was a marathon, not a sprint, how champions thought differently than ordinary soldiers. She watched the unit's top 2 performers, analyzing their techniques, their mental approaches, their strategies for managing fatigue. She filled notebooks with observations, creating mental models of excellence. The other recruits didn't notice her transformation because it wasn't visible. There were no dramatic improvements in her times. She still finished in the middle of the pack during runs, but something had changed fundamentally in how she approached every challenge. She was no longer trying to prove something to Bradford or to anyone else. She was proving something to herself. And that distinction, that internal shift from external validation to internal conviction, was where real transformation began. Week 7 arrived with an announcement that electrified the training yard with a palpable energy that hadn't existed before. Sergeant Hayes gathered the unit in the assembly hall, his voice cutting through the murmuring crowd with the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. "Listen up," he commanded, his gaze sweeping across the gathered recruits. "This week marks the physical fitness assessment phase. For those of you unfamiliar with what that means, it's the most grueling, most challenging evaluation you'll face during basic training." He paused, allowing the weight of his words to settle. "Specifically, we'll be conducting the unit run, 5 miles in full combat gear, 70 pounds of equipment strapped to your bodies, no water stations until mile 3, no excuses, no mercy." His expression remained utterly impassive, as if he were discussing something as mundane as the weather. The record holder specialist completed the course in 38 minutes and 12 seconds. That record has stood for 3 years. No one has come close to breaking it. A murmur rippled through the assembled recruits. 38 minutes and 12 seconds, 5 miles, 70 pounds. The mathematics of it seemed impossible for most of them. Hayes continued, his voice hardening further. "This run serves multiple purposes. First, it qualifies you for advanced assignments. Second, it determines leadership potential for future deployment teams. Third, it separates soldiers from quitters. We don't care if you finish slowly. We care if you finish at all. Some of you won't. That's acceptable. This is where the weak identify themselves and remove themselves from consideration." Sarah listened from her position in the formation, her expression unchanged. Around her, recruits began calculating, strategizing, discussing their approaches in hushed tones. Some expressed confidence. Others looked terrified. Sarah said nothing, simply absorbing the information and filing it away with the thousands of other details she'd been collecting over the past 7 weeks. Stood confidently among his peers, clearly expecting to hold his crown. He was the epitome of the ideal soldier, 6'2", muscular without appearing bloated, with the casual confidence of someone whose physical abilities had never been questioned. He caught Sarah looking at him and offered a dismissive smirk, the kind of expression that communicated absolute certainty in his superiority. Sarah didn't react. She simply turned her attention elsewhere. That evening, Bradford watched from the command tent as the final preparations were made. Officers clustered around him, discussing potential candidates who might break his record or at least push him hard. Names were mentioned. Predictions were made. Calculations were performed. Bradford's own assessment of the recruits seemed to have shifted slightly. His initial harsh judgments had given way to more nuanced evaluations. But Sarah was not among those discussed. She'd become, in his mind, simply another soldier, competent enough but unremarkable, not the kind of recruit whose name you'd remember years later. He'd long forgotten about his earlier dismissal of her. It was simply one comment among thousands he'd made over his career, erased from his consciousness as completely as yesterday's weather. The morning of the run arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that made the air itself feel like an adversary. The unit assembled on the starting line at 6 a.m., before the absolute worst of the day's heat could develop. Stood at the front of the group, his uniform already darkened with sweat from his pre-run warm-up. His breathing was controlled and measured. His muscles were loose and ready. Everything about him screamed preparation and confidence. Sarah stood in the middle of the pack, her face betraying nothing. Her uniform was clean and dry. Her breathing was calm and steady. Unlike she hadn't done any dramatic warm-up routine. She'd simply eaten a light breakfast, hydrated carefully, and prepared herself mentally. The other recruits glanced around at each other, assessing competition, wondering where they'd finish. There was a tangible electricity in the air, the kind of anticipatory tension that precedes something significant. Everyone sensed that this moment mattered. This run would define them in ways that classroom performance or written examinations could not. Bradford sat in the command tent, stopwatch in hand, prepared to time the leading runners. His focus was already on, genuinely curious whether the record would hold or whether this year might produce someone capable of breaking it. Hayes stood beside the starting line, his stopwatch synchronized with Bradford's, ready to mark official times. The whistle blew sharply, cutting through the humid air like a blade. Exploded forward immediately, his long legs churning powerfully, his body mechanics nearly perfect. He'd clearly trained extensively for this moment, possibly more than any other recruit in the unit. He shot to the front, his pace so aggressive that most recruits fell immediately behind, unable to match his opening speed. Sarah settled into a steady position in the middle of the pack, neither pushing aggressively forward nor allowing herself to drift backward. She wasn't thinking about records. She wasn't thinking about Bradford or his dismissal or the officer who'd predicted her failure. She was simply thinking about running smart, running steady, and running exactly as she'd trained herself to run over the past 7 weeks of relentless preparation. She was thinking about the moment she'd been training for since the officer dismissed her. That moment was arriving, but she didn't know it yet. Around her, other recruits pushed and strained, continued his relentless pace ahead. The 5-mile course stretched before them all, waiting to reveal who among them had the strength, physical and mental, to claim glory. Mile 3 arrived with brutal suddenness, and the landscape of the race transformed fundamentally. The water stations materialized like mirages, and exhausted recruits surged toward them with desperate gratitude. Some gulped water carelessly, allowing liquid to spill down their chins. Others drank strategically, understanding that too much water too quickly would create digestive distress. Sarah drank measured amounts, just enough to replenish without overloading her system. She'd trained for this specific moment dozens of times, understanding that hydration strategy separated experienced runners from amateurs. Around mile 3 1/4, something extraordinary happened within Sarah's body. A door opened, not metaphorically, but physiologically tangible. Her legs, which had been burning and protesting throughout the first 3 miles, suddenly shifted into a different operational mode. Her breathing remained steady and deep, while others around her began to rasp and falter, their earlier aggressive packing now exacting its terrible price. She could sense the change in her body's chemistry, the shift from anaerobic to aerobic, from struggling to gliding. Something essential shifted inside her consciousness as well, a door opening to reserves she'd been quietly accumulating through every painful sunrise run, every late-night training session, every moment of ignored doubt and dismissed potential. All of that preparation, all of that suffering, all of that invisible work suddenly had purpose. It crystallized into forward momentum. She glided past, a tall recruit from Texas who'd been maintaining a respectable pace. He didn't even seem to notice her passing, so focused was he on his own internal battle with exhaustion. Then Williams, a former college football player whose natural athleticism had carried him through the first 3 miles, but was now failing him as his conditioning proved insufficient. Then, a muscular recruit whose bulk, so advantageous in strength competitions, now became a liability in endurance testing. The spectators lining the course began murmuring. "Moving up," someone whispered to his companion, genuine surprise coloring his voice. Other observers began watching her more intently, noticing the smooth, efficient way she was consuming distance. There was no desperate struggle in her movements, no thrashing desperation. She was running like someone possessed of a secret, a knowledge that victory was achievable. Bradford stood abruptly from his chair in the command tent, his attention shifting to the emerging competitor. His stopwatch continued clicking, and the numbers his eyes were reading contradicted his expectations. Was ahead of pace by nearly a full minute at the 3-mile mark. The realization struck him like cold water. His earlier dismissal, his casual prediction of failure, suddenly seemed not just wrong but almost comically misjudged. Realized he was being hunted. The awareness came to him around mile 3.5, a creeping sensation that someone was catching up, someone was coming for his record. He tried to accelerate, calling upon reserves he believed he possessed, but his body refused. He'd already given everything in those early miles, burning through his fuel with reckless abandon. Nothing remained to access. He was running on fumes now, maintaining position through sheer willpower and pride. Sarah's form remained perfect, shoulders relaxed despite the intense physical effort, breathing deep and rhythmic, her gaze locked forward with laser-like focus. She was not running with desperation or aggression. She was running like someone executing a plan she'd rehearsed 1,000 times in her mind. Every stride was economical. Every breath was measured. Every meter of distance was consumed with precision. By mile 4, she had moved into the top 5 finishers and was still climbing. The gap between her and began widening with mathematical inevitability. He tried to maintain his pace, tried to convince his body that it had more to give, but the physics of exhaustion were unforgiving. His stride began shortening. His breathing became ragged. His form deteriorated. Sarah glided past Martinez at mile 4.2, past Jackson at mile 4.4. The spectators were now openly watching her, some of them pointing, some of them shouting encouragement. The momentum was undeniable. The inevitability was becoming clear to everyone except possibly himself, who still maintained hope that he could resist this unexpected challenge. At mile 4.5, Sarah moved past. This time he could not keep up. His body simply would not respond to the demands his mind was making. He watched helplessly as she pulled ahead, her efficiency highlighting his own deteriorating form. The gap widened with each passing second, 5 meters, then 10, then 20. Was no longer competing. He was simply surviving, trying to finish with dignity, already knowing his record was gone. The final half-mile belonged entirely to Sarah. She could feel the intensity of the eyes upon her, shock, disbelief, amazement radiating from the spectators. But she didn't think about any of it. She didn't allow external awareness to penetrate her focus. She thought about the weeks of early morning runs, the pain in her foot, the stress fracture that had nearly ended everything, the comments she'd endured, and most importantly, the officer who said she wouldn't last. She thought about proving him wrong. Her legs found another gear, not because she'd been holding back, but because the mind's power over the body is unlimited when belief is absolute. She accelerated down the final stretch, her breathing still controlled, her form still perfect, her determination still absolute. The finish line materialized ahead, growing larger with each stride. She was going to break the record. The realization crystallized with absolute certainty. She was going to run into history. Sarah crossed the finish line at 37 minutes and 43 seconds. The yard erupted into chaos. The transformation was instantaneous and absolute. Silence became cacophony. Stillness became motion. Disbelief became jubilation. Soldiers who'd been watching with casual interest suddenly erupted in cheers, their voices merging into a roar of celebration that seemed to shake the very foundations of the training yard. The record that had stood for 3 years, the benchmark that had seemed unbreakable, had just been shattered by the recruit everyone had dismissed as too small, too fragile, too obviously inadequate. Sarah stumbled across the finish line, her chest heaving with exertion so complete that her entire body seemed to be composed of pure exhaustion. Her legs threatened to give way beneath her. Her vision swam slightly. Sweat streamed down her face in quantities that seemed to defy the laws of physics. But she remained upright, her mental discipline refusing to allow her body to collapse even though every fiber of her being screamed for rest. Was the first to reach her, nearly tackling her in an explosive celebration, his own voice hoarse from screaming encouragement. "Oh my God, you did it! You actually did it!" Other recruits converged, slapping her back, offering congratulations, their earlier skepticism transformed into genuine admiration. The training yard had become a place of pure celebration, the rigid military hierarchy temporarily dissolved in the face of something extraordinary. Sarah removed her helmet slowly, her hands shaking with adrenaline and physical depletion. Sweat dripped from her face in rivulets. Her breathing came in deep, ragged gasps that gradually began to normalize. She stood among her celebrating peers, still processing what had just happened, still coming down from the neurochemical high that had carried her across the finish line. She was wrecked but unbowed, completely destroyed physically but mentally intact, unbroken. Bradford approached immediately, moving with purpose through the celebrating crowd. His expression was unreadable until he spoke, and even then the words came carefully as if he was choosing each one with precision. "Private, that was extraordinary." The pause stretched between them, heavy, weighted, full of meaning that transcended the simple words. His earlier assessment, his casual prediction of failure, his dismissal of her potential, all of it hung in that silence. "I was wrong about you. Completely and utterly wrong." Sarah stood at attention, still breathing hard, her body still recovering from the intense physical exertion. Military protocol demanded she acknowledge her superior officer's words with respect, but something shifted in how she chose to respond. "Sir, I don't need an apology," she said, her voice steady despite her physical exhaustion. "I needed you to be wrong. That's all I needed, for you to be wrong and for me to prove it." The words hung perfectly in the humid Georgia air, carrying weight that transcended the immediate moment. They were not defiant or disrespectful. They were simply honest. They acknowledged the dynamic that had driven her forward, not a need for his approval or validation, but a need to prove that his judgment had been flawed. His dismissal had become her fuel. His certainty had become her motivation. Bradford nodded slowly, and in that nod was genuine acknowledgement, a recognition that he'd witnessed something remarkable, and more importantly, that he'd been present at the moment when a soldier was truly born. "Welcome to the Army, Private, really welcome." Around them, the unit continued to celebrate wildly, the initial excitement showing no signs of abating. Soldiers were already beginning to understand that they'd witnessed history, that they'd been present for a moment that would be talked about for years to come. The smallest recruit had just set the standard for everyone else. The dismissed one had become the exemplary one. Later that afternoon, himself approached Sarah. His handshake was firm and warm, his expression genuinely respectful. His words were equally genuine. "That was the most incredible thing I've ever seen on this base," he said, his tone carrying absolute sincerity. 3743. "I've been running seriously for 5 years, and I've never seen anyone do what you just did. How did you find another gear at mile 4? How did you know you had more?" Sarah smiled tiredly, her muscles still aching despite the adrenaline beginning to wear off. The true exhaustion of what she just endured was beginning to settle into her bones. "I didn't find it," she responded simply. "I didn't know I had it until I needed it. I built it, week by week, moment by moment. Every early morning run, every extra conditioning session, every time I wanted to quit and didn't, that was me building the gear. It was never about this one run. It was about being ready when the moment came." Absorbed her words, understanding at a fundamental level that what he just witnessed transcended athletic achievement. He'd witnessed someone proving something profound about human potential, about the gap between what people believe is possible and what actually becomes possible when belief is absolute and effort is relentless. That evening, the unit held an informal celebration. Sarah sat among them, suddenly transformed from outsider to inspiration. Stories were already being created, already being modified and enhanced. By the time the sun set, the version being told was even more dramatic than reality, which was extraordinary in itself, a testament to how unprecedented her achievement seemed to everyone who'd witnessed it. The weeks following the record-breaking run transformed Sarah's standing within the unit so completely that it was almost as if a different person had arrived at Fort Benning. The invisible hierarchy that had placed her at the bottom, the unspoken ranking that had marked her as inadequate, had inverted entirely. She was no longer the questionable recruit. She was the inspiration. She was the proof that potential couldn't be judged by appearance or initial assessment. She was the living embodiment of possibility. Recruits who'd previously dismissed her or treated her with barely concealed skepticism now approached her actively seeking training advice. "Private, how do you maintain your pace during long runs? What's your strategy for managing fatigue? Can you watch my form during conditioning? I want to improve like you did." She'd become a resource, a mentor, a walking blueprint for excellence. Sarah accepted these roles without arrogance or self-importance, understanding that the true measure of leadership wasn't claiming authority, but offering genuine help to those still struggling. Officers requested her for advanced programs, leadership training, specialized fitness certification, additional tactical instruction. Her name appeared on lists for promotion consideration and fast-track development tracks. Sergeant, the harshest trainer who'd pushed her relentlessly during those early weeks, actually smiled at her one morning during formation. His weathered face cracked into an expression that rarely surfaced. "You showed real guts," he said gruffly, his words carrying the weight of genuine respect from someone whose approval was earned through action rather than given freely. Real guts. That's what separates soldiers from civilians. That's what I was looking for all along. But Sarah never allowed success to inflate her ego or transform her approach. If anything, she worked harder, pushing herself with even greater intensity despite having already proven her capabilities. She understood something crucial that separated mediocre soldiers from truly excellent ones. One victory doesn't make a soldier. Consistency does. Reliability does. Heart does. The ability to show up every single day and be excellent, regardless of whether anyone is watching or acknowledging the effort. That's what creates real soldiers. She volunteered for every challenging assignment that came available. When extra guard duties were offered, she claimed them. When additional tactical exercises were announced, she participated. When struggling soldiers needed mentoring or encouragement, she provided it without hesitation. She began to understand that her record run, as significant as it was simply a moment, a single point in time that highlighted her capabilities. But what truly mattered was what happened in all the moments that followed, the daily decisions to maintain excellence and support others in their own journeys. Bradford requested a private meeting in his office near the end of week 7. The summons made Sarah momentarily nervous. Military history was filled with stories of private meetings that preceded unwelcome news. But when she entered his office and saw his expression, she understood this was different. He gestured to a chair across from his desk, and they sat in the kind of formal setting that suggested something significant was about to be discussed. "Private, I've been reviewing your file extensively," Bradford began, his voice measured and thoughtful. "I want to outline some pathways that I believe are available to you, given your demonstrated capabilities." He proceeded to describe officer training school, specialized operations consideration, leadership development programs, advanced certifications that could accelerate her career trajectory. Each option represented a potential future, a way to leverage her proven abilities into positions of greater responsibility and influence. "You have exceptional physical capability," Bradford continued, "but more importantly, you have something rarer: mental toughness, genuine mental toughness. Real soldiers possess it. That quality can't be taught in a classroom. It can't be developed through any program or certification. Either you have it or you don't. You have it in abundance." Sarah thanked him quietly, her response measured and thoughtful rather than enthusiastic or eager. "I appreciate the opportunities, sir," she said. "I'll pursue whatever path allows me to serve most effectively. But if I'm being honest, I'm not focused on rank or advancement right now. I'm focused on being the best soldier I can be, wherever I'm assigned. Everything else seems like it should follow naturally from that." Bradford studied her, and she sensed that her response had communicated something important: not ambition for its own sake, but commitment to excellence for its own sake. There was a difference, subtle but profound, between soldiers who pursued advancement as a goal and soldiers who pursued excellence as a way of life. "That's the right answer," he said finally. "The best leaders I've known throughout my career weren't people chasing positions. They were people committed to excellence. Position followed naturally because people recognized that commitment. You're going to have a remarkable career, Private. I suspect we'll be working together for many years to come." That evening, Sarah walked the perimeter of the base alone, something she'd done countless times over the past 7 weeks. But everything felt different now. The weight of dismissal had lifted. The burden of proving herself had transformed into something else, not relief exactly, but rather a different kind of motivation. She'd proven something to others. Now she could focus on proving things to herself, pushing boundaries that extended beyond what anyone else expected of her. She thought about the journey from week 1 to this moment, from the officer's dismissal to his respect, from injury and doubt to triumph, from isolation to acceptance. The external validation had been meaningful, but she understood now that it was the internal transformation that truly mattered. She'd become the person she'd always believed she could be, regardless of what anyone else believed. Graduation day arrived with all the ceremonial grandeur that the United States Army could muster. The parade ground at Fort Benning was transformed into a theater of military precision. Thousands of soldiers standing in perfect formation, dress uniforms immaculate, boots polished to mirror shine, every detail executed with the kind of meticulous attention that characterized military culture. Families filled the bleachers, cameras ready, proud tears already forming in anticipation of this moment they'd been waiting for. Sarah stood in formation with her platoon, her dress uniform fitting perfectly now despite her small frame. The green fabric seemed to drape with intention, as if acknowledging that she'd earned the right to wear it with pride. Her face remained characteristically neutral, but internally she was processing the magnitude of what had transpired over these past 8 weeks. The transformation from dismissed recruit to exemplary soldier felt simultaneously real and dreamlike. Bradford presented her with multiple commendations during the formal ceremony. Her record-breaking achievement was noted officially, her name announced over the loudspeaker system for the assembled crowd to hear. Applause erupted, genuine applause from soldiers who understood what she'd accomplished, from families who recognized excellence when they witnessed it. She accepted each commendation with a salute, her expression composed despite the overwhelming emotions moving through her. But even as she stood receiving recognition, Sarah understood something crucial. Commendations were simply acknowledgement of moments already past. The real work, the real test, was still ahead. She'd proven herself once. Now came the much harder task of proving herself consistently, day after day, in circumstances she couldn't yet anticipate, facing challenges she couldn't yet imagine. As she left the parade ground in her dress uniform, walking through corridors she'd come to know intimately, Sarah reflected on the 8 weeks behind her. She thought about the officer who'd said she wouldn't last, the stress fracture that nearly ended everything, the injury that required her to choose between quitting and pushing forward. She thought about every painful run, every moment of doubt, every instance when her body screamed at her to stop but her mind refused to listen. 3 months later, stationed at Fort Stewart, Georgia, with the 3rd Infantry Division, Sarah's real education continued in earnest. Fort Stewart was larger than Fort Benning, more complex in its organizational structure, filled with soldiers who'd already completed multiple deployments and carried themselves with the confidence of combat-tested warriors. She was no longer the new recruit receiving introductory training. She was an actual soldier in an actual unit, expected to perform at the level her commendations suggested she'd achieved. Her commanding officer on the first day pulled her aside privately, away from the other soldiers. His name was Colonel James Harrison, a man whose face carried the weathered lines of someone who'd seen genuine combat, who'd made decisions in circumstances where the stakes involved human lives. His office was sparse and professional, walls adorned with photographs from various postings and deployments, visual evidence of a career spanning multiple continents and numerous conflicts. "I've heard about the record run at Benning," Harrison said without preamble, his voice carrying the kind of directness that suggested he didn't waste time on unnecessary formality. "That's impressive, genuinely impressive, but I want you to understand something clearly. Here at Fort Stewart, we don't care about records. We don't celebrate clocks or personal achievements. What we celebrate is soldiers who are reliable, who are there when it matters, who bring their unit home." Sarah met his eyes steadily, understanding that this was a test of a different kind, not physical, but philosophical. This officer was assessing whether she'd internalized the lessons of her training or whether she'd become attached to the mythology of her achievement. "Yes, sir," she responded. "I've learned that the real test isn't beating a clock, it's being there when your unit needs you. That's what matters." Harrison nodded slowly, and something in his expression suggested satisfaction. "Good answer. Welcome to the 3rd Infantry Division, Private. We're going to work well together." That evening appeared at her barracks. He'd been assigned to the same division, their paths converging once again. They embraced like old friends reuniting after years of separation rather than months. They talked for hours, comparing notes on their experiences, processing the intensity of basic training together, understanding that they'd shared something profound that bonded them permanently. Later, alone in her bunk, Sarah wrote a letter home to her family in Montana. She didn't mention the record run or the commendations or the officer's earlier dismissal. Instead, she wrote, "I've discovered something essential about human potential. The greatest triumph isn't proving others wrong. It's proving to yourself that you're capable of more than you ever imagined." That's when you truly become a soldier, not when someone else recognizes it, but when you know it absolutely, without question, without the need for external validation. She continued writing. "The officer who said I wouldn't last, he was both wrong and right. He was wrong about my ability. He was right about the fact that I wouldn't last as the person I was when I arrived. That person is gone. Someone different is writing this letter, someone stronger, someone who understands that the real battle isn't with others. It's with yourself, with your doubts, with your limitations." She sealed the envelope and looked out the window at Fort Stewart stretching before her in the evening darkness. Lights dotted the landscape, barracks, training facilities, administrative buildings, all of it representing the infrastructure of military life. She understood now that her journey had only just begun. The record run was a moment. This was a lifetime. This was purpose. That night, Sarah slept soundly, her dreams filled not with past triumphs but with future possibilities. She'd learned to run faster than anyone expected. Now she would learn to lead, to think strategically, to make decisions in circumstances where the stakes extended far beyond personal achievement. Her transformation from dismissed recruit to respected soldier had only been the beginning. The real work was just starting.